Now let's move on and talk about some of the vessels of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So right here is about where the heart would be. And this is your aorta that comes out of the heart. You have your ascending aorta, your aortic arch, and then your descending aorta, which takes the form of your thoracic aorta in your thoracic cavity and your abdominal aorta in your abdominal cavity. It's all the same vessel. It's just one aorta, but we call it by slightly different names based on where it is at any given time. You have arteries that come out between the ribs, and those are called intercostal arteries. Intercostal just means between the ribs. You may notice at the bottom here, you have phrenic arteries. These are superior phrenic. Phrenic always refers to the diaphragm. Now, as we get into the abdominal cavity, we'll look at this a little more closely later, but you have a celiac trunk right here, which is, it's a trunk, so it's immediately going to branch. It branches into your left gastric artery, which is going to go to your stomach, as you might expect, your splenic artery, which will go to your spleen, and your hepatic artery, which is going to go to your liver, which is not here right now, but this is your common hepatic artery. As you go down your abdominal aorta, the next thing that comes out is your superior mesenteric artery. Now, your superior mesenteric artery is going to go to your mesenteries and ultimately to your intestines. This is bringing blood to your intestines, not only to drop off oxygen, but to pick up your nutrients, right? Your amino acids and glucose and all those things that you're absorbing through your intestines. Same with your inferior mesenteric artery down here, right? Superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric. You also have a couple of very skinny arteries that come out on the side here. Now, these are cut off there, but they would go all the way down to your gonads. These are your gonadal arteries. So in males, they'll feed the testes. In females, they'll feed the ovaries. Now, you can also see your renal arteries here. These are pretty large arteries. You have one that feeds each kidney. Renal is always going to refer to your kidney. You also have adrenal arteries that feed your adrenal glands, or sometimes they're called suprarenal arteries, because sometimes your adrenal gland is called your suprarenal gland. Now, we'll get more into the arteries of the legs later, but your aorta, which comes down through the center of your body, branches into two slightly smaller arteries. These are your iliac arteries, specifically your common iliac arteries. You have a right and a left common iliac artery. Now, whenever you have common, you're going to see some branching, just like trunk, right? So your common iliac artery is going to branch into your external and internal iliac arteries that you can't see right here. Now, flipping around and looking at your veins. Okay, your veins, coming from the bottom up, you're going to have common iliac veins, which are formed when the internal and external iliac veins come together. Again, we'll look at the legs in a bit. Those common iliac veins, right and left, will come together to form your inferior vena cava. And all of these veins of the abdomen will dump into the inferior vena cava, right? So your gonadal veins will dump ultimately into the vena cava. Your renal veins will dump into the vena cava, which will take blood back up through your thoracic cavity and into the right atrium of your heart. You also have a superior vena cava up here, which you can see. Now, this is a closer and more detailed look at your abdomen. The celiac trunk, you can see your left gastric going straight to the stomach here, right? And you can see your splenic coming down here to your spleen, and you can see your common hepatic going over to your liver. Hepatic always refers to your liver. You can also see your superior mesenteric artery and your inferior mesenteric artery branching and going to your intestines. And again, here you don't see them, but these would be branching through a type of tissue called a mesentery that we'll discuss more when we get to your intestines. You may remember it from the very first lab of Bio 151 when you dissected the rat. When you pulled the intestines out, there was sort of a translucent membrane that held the intestines together. That was called your mesentery. Now, you have very similar veins. You have inferior and superior mesenteric veins, but all of these things come back together along with your gastric vein to dump into the hepatic portal vein. Now, a portal vein, just like in your hypophyseal portal system with your hypophyseal portal vein, you have in a situation where instead of just an artery leading to a single set of capillaries and a vein leading back to the heart, you have an artery leading to a set of capillaries, and then you have an extra vessel, a portal vein, leading to a second set of capillaries, and then you have a vein leading back to the heart. So you have an extra vessel and an extra set of capillaries. In this case, this extra vessel is taking blood from the capillaries in your intestines where you picked up all these nutrients to a second set of capillaries in your liver where all those nutrients are going to get processed and where you're going to take those amino acids and make blood proteins. And you're going to store some of that glucose as glycogen, right? So this hepatic portal vein, hepatic refers to your liver. This is different from your hepatic vein, which just drains the liver into the inferior vena cava. The hepatic portal vein drains your superior and inferior mesenteric vein, all of this stuff, and dumps it all into the capillaries of your liver. Now, if we scooch down to the leg, we have your common iliac artery, right? You have a right and a left. Remember, these branched from your single aorta into your right and left common iliac artery. This very quickly will branch into an internal iliac, which kind of goes into your pelvic cavity, and an external iliac, which is a large vessel, which will come down to your femoral region. And at that point, after some branching, this external iliac becomes your femoral artery. And you have a deep femoral that branches off from that, et cetera, but your femoral artery is a very major artery that comes down through your leg, your thigh. Now that will branch into a couple of different arteries. You have a popliteal that goes around the back of your knee, which you can see here, and you have a posterior and an anterior tibial artery. And those are just right on your tibia here. This is your anterior tibial artery that goes down the front. You also have a fibular that goes down the side of the fibula, but you can't see that very well here. It's small. So essentially, you're going to have this anterior tibial, and that's the important one up front. And that will dump into your dorsalis pedis, which goes on the top of your foot, right? And then you have a plantar arch on the bottom of your foot. In terms of veins, they're going to be similar, especially your deep veins, right? We have digital veins and a plantar venous arch and a dorsal venous arch, kind of like the dorsalis pedis, that are draining blood from your foot. You have an anterior and posterior tibial vein, right? So posterior is in the back, anterior is in the front. You have a popliteal vein, and again, popliteal is the region in the back of your knee, like if you get popped in the back of the knee if you don't pay your debts, right? It's popliteal. And then that will dump into your femoral vein, which comes up to the top. All of this will dump into your external iliac artery. You have an external iliac vein. You have an internal iliac vein. They'll dump into your common iliac vein. All of that is very much like the arteries. But you also have a very important superficial vein that goes all the way up the inside of your leg. This is the longest vein in your body, and it's called your great saphenous vein. Great saphenous. And again, it runs from the inside of your foot, right, all the way up the inside of your leg until it dumps into your external iliac vein. Now, as we finish up chapter 19, I want to talk about one more topic, and it is fetal circulation. So fetal circulation is going to be similar in most ways to normal adult human circulation, except that you are not oxygenating your blood at your lungs when you're a fetus. You're doing it at the placenta. You're also not getting your nutrients or dropping off your wastes at your intestines or your kidneys. You're doing it at the placenta. And so you have a set of umbilical arteries and veins that go to and from the placenta. But the arteries are leaving the fetal heart and going towards the placenta, because our arteries go away from the heart. And the veins are coming back from the placenta toward the fetal heart, right? Because that's what veins do. And like your pulmonary circuit, these are going to be reversed in terms of oxygenation from what you typically think of with your systemic circuit. So umbilical arteries are going to be deoxygenated. They are going to the placenta to pick up oxygen and glucose and nutrients and to drop off CO2. The umbilical vein is going to bring oxygenated blood back toward the fetus. And it's going to drain into something called the ductus venosus, which is a little duct, which is going to dump into your inferior vena cava, bring it back to your heart. You obviously, your umbilical veins and arteries are in the umbilical cord. Those fall off after you're born. This ductus venosus is on the inside, so it remains there, but you don't need it after you're born. And so it degenerates into these fibrous cords that you will wind up seeing on your liver. There are a couple other differences that you'll see in fetal circulation, and those are the foramen-ovale and ductus arteriosus. Both of these have to do with preventing blood from going to the lungs. So we need all of our blood to go to our lungs to pick up oxygen. Now, the fetus needs some of the blood to go to the lungs because it needs to feed the lungs so they can grow, but it by no means needs all of your blood to go to the lungs because the lungs are not functional in terms of oxygenating. So these are two ways that you can kind of bypass that pulmonary circuit. And this is essentially what that looks like, right? So here, coming off of the internal iliac arteries, which are deoxygenated in the baby, but internal iliac arteries, come your umbilical arteries. And you have two of them, one from each internal iliac, and they come out and go to the placenta. And you have a single umbilical vein that comes back. And again, that's the red one because this is oxygenated. And it comes through this ductus venosus and dumps into your inferior vena cava, which comes back to your heart. Again, this ductus venosus hardens up when you are born and becomes a fibrous cord that will be attached to your liver, which we'll look at when we get to the digestive system. Now, the next couple of changes are going to be with your foramen ovale, which is between your atria, and your ductus arteriosus, which is between your pulmonary trunk and your aorta, and we're going to zoom in to look at those a little bit more closely. So when you are a fetus, the blood that comes back into your right atrium from the inferior vena cava is oxygenated, right? And so when it goes to your right ventricle, it gets pumped out your pulmonary trunk to go to your lungs. It doesn't really need to go to your lungs, not all of it anyway. And so you have a hole between your right atrium and your left atrium called your foramen ovale, which means oval hole, to allow this oxygenated blood to just skip the pulmonary circuit, go directly into the left side of the heart, and then get pumped out the aorta. Again, all the blood doesn't do that, but some of it does. And this clearly has to close when you're born, so that foramen ovale becomes a fossa ovalis. Fossa means like a depression. Like in The Lion King, when Mufasa died, it made me depressed mildly. So, mild depression. He also died by falling into a depression, but that's a whole other thing. So, foramen ovale closes and becomes a fossa ovalis between your atria. Just a little depression. You also have what was the ductus arteriosus. So for some of the blood that still goes down to your right ventricle, gets pumped out of your pulmonary trunk, instead of sending it through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, a lot of it goes directly through a duct into your aorta and then out to your body. Because again, it doesn't have to go to your lungs. Through a duct called the ductus arteriosus. Now, this also has to close when you're born, or by the time you're born, so that we don't skip the pulmonary circuit. And it becomes this little ligament called the ligamentum arteriosum, which is a Harry Potter word, I know. Nevertheless, it holds your aorta and your pulmonary trunk together when you are an adult human, and it is your ligamentum arteriosum. Now, in addition to that foramen ovale needing to close and become the fossa ovalis, and if it doesn't, you have a hole between your atria, your ventricles also have an interventricular septum that is not fully closed when you're a fetus and needs to close up by the time you're an adult. And sometimes that doesn't work, and you have a defect where you don't have a full ventricular septum. This means you're not pumping blood efficiently because you're mixing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. When you hear that a baby has a hole in their heart when they're born, this is usually what people are talking about. And sometimes that has to be surgically repaired so that you're not mixing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood.